Genetics in breeding can be a very complicated topic, and my goal in this video is to simplify this issue a little bit for you and help define some terminology so that as you are starting to breed pigs, you're able to refine a handful of the key concepts that you need to have some understanding and mastery of to be able to build better pigs that are going to perform better and that are going to improve what you're doing on your farm. I'm Stephen Reichert, and this is Rowan Ridge Farm. We are in Western New Hampshire, raising heritage hogs on pasture and breeding them. And this is a series that I am doing all about breeding because I got a handful of questions in my email, and I figured I want you to be able to click on the link to the playlist below and have access to videos that are going to give you questions and answers that you need. If you subscribe to this channel, you'll be notified when I produce videos, and we'll be able to see these things, and we can continue the conversation and improve what we're doing as a group here. One of the big benefits of breeding your own hogs is the fact that you get to take control over the genetics, and you get to mix the ingredients and assemble the puzzle in a way that is going to work better for the needs that you have. And some of it just comes down to personal preference. Ultimately, genetic quality is not a matter of saying which breed is better. It's a little bit more of a deeper dive, even within breeds, and looking at the way breeds are crossed and mixed. First thing I want to mention is this book here, which is Swine Production. This was written by Bundy and Diggins. I have the third edition, and this was written in 1970. So you can find this book on eBay, Swine Production. The covers are different, and they're a variety of different iterations. But if you are interested in breeding pigs, this is kind of like the Bible on breeding. And it's not a huge book, but it is one that I would absolutely recommend that you have in your library to refer back to, because it gives a lot of clarification on genetic principles that are going to help you select and build a herd with the best animals that you can acquire. I would be interested to hear in the comments below if you guys have specific books that you would recommend as being sort of foundational to what you have been doing up till this point with your venture in homesteading and farming. Please do let me know, because I love books and I like to pass along those recommendations. Let's start off by just defining a couple of terms. I'm not going to make this overly academic, but genotype is genetic characteristics that are sort of baked into the DNA. And then phenotype is a physical manifestation of the genotype. So I have brown eyes, or I am over 6 feet tall. There are genotypes that I was born with that are in my DNA that are encoded to give me the phenotype, or the physical manifestation of these characteristics that, as I have kids, you can see, like with a couple of my daughters, even at relatively young ages, they also have some of these same characteristics that were passed on genetically, despite their mothers being very short. They got the gene for the height from me, and that is the phenotype. So the first thing I want to touch on is the discussion of what breed of pigs is best, because anything genetically, people usually go right from we want good genetics to, oh, what's the best breed? And the reality is that when we are talking about a breed, so let's just take Berkshires, for example, they are an inbred group. And I don't mean inbred in the colloquial sense, like where cousins are getting married and they're inbred, or brothers and sisters, like some incestuous weird thing. When we say inbred, we mean bred within the breed, within that genetic group. So they are maintained a purebred to make a purebred animal. So you have this inbred group that is ultimately genetically relatively similar, at least in terms of the big things like with coloration and some of their growth genes. But then there are still room for variability, and you can select accordingly within that group. But the point is to understand that different breeds are going to have better and worse representation of their genetic traits throughout. So simply having Berkshires does not guarantee you that you're going to have great meat, even though a lot of people who breed Berkshires will say, oh, it's the Wagyu of pork because it's a Japanese Kurobota pork and it's genetically superior, yada. And there certainly are genetic lines within the Berkshire herd that have the benefit of those breeding and those characteristics, but that's not a universal thing. There are still dry pork chops within Berkshire genetic lineages. So it's ultimately up to each breeder to be able to select the best characteristics to pair them together and to try to patch in one piece at a time. And so I have done videos about what breed is the best. I encourage you to check some of those out. It's the genetic selection between breeds and crossing those breeds that are going to give you new advances and better growth, better carcass quality on your animals. That also brings us to the point then of, is it better to own purebred pigs or is it better to have crossbred pigs? Because purebred sounds better, right? And I know when I got started with breeding, the idea was if you have purebred animals, like you're a cut above, you're on a top shelf. You don't have like this riffraff, these crossbred animals. But the reality is that you have to know what you're aiming for. What's the target you're aiming for when you start breeding? Because you're going to use different tools to go from A to B. So if you're using an inbred group, meaning a purebred group of animals, you're going to want to use that typically to create additional breeding stock, not necessarily for feeders, because an inbred group, there's going to be less genetic variation than if you take two separate and distinct inbred groups like a Berkshire and a Duroc and you cross them, then those two, you're going to have a lot of genetic differences and it's going to be a lot of hybrid vigor or heterosis, as they call it. And that can lead to, depending on how the combinations are made, between 10 and 15% increased growth. And that's a really important thing. And you're not getting that if you have a purebred herd. You're getting that when you take one purebred and you cross it with a purebred of a different breed, creating a cross with two purebred parents. That's where you actually get the benefit. And not only do you get increased growth rate and protein and feed conversion, you're also getting hardiness and better durability out there in the environment that you're raising the animals in. They're going to be less susceptible to illness. And all of those things translate to a better product and better bottom line in the process of creating that product. So purebreds, really important because they're very raw ingredients for breeding herds. And then the crosses are generally going to be more useful for making meat. And ultimately, like they call these terminal crosses, because when you have an animal that has been crossed a few different ways, if you cross them with another cross or you try to create another cross on top of them, you're not going to get any more. You've kind of hit a dead end in terms of how much hybrid vigor you can get from crossbreeding them. And then at that point, they're as good as they're going to get with that breeding. They're 3 or 4 generations into it. And then everything that's produced from that pairing is going to meet. It's terminal. It's not going to be continuing on further than that. So understanding like what is your main goal? Are you trying to raise hogs for meat? Or are you trying to raise a purebred herd that you can sell as breeders? And this is the reason why breeding stock costs more money, or should, when you're selling piglets. Breeding stock are going to cost more money coming from purebred parents than are the crossbred animals. But if you have a good crossbred that's made intentionally, a lot of times, I know when I started out, I look at crossbred animals as being like some kind of good enough for government work, a type of mishap. But the reality is a crossbred is supposed to be made intentionally to add different pieces into that porky puzzle that are going to create a more complete, better structured, more meat and faster developing animal that has more of the carcass qualities and characteristics like intramuscular marbling. So it looks like a ribeye off of a nice fat cow when you take it out, instead of a pork chop that looks like a dry chicken breast that has no fat in the muscle and the fat is all on the outside in like a fat cap, which is what most of the production pork that we see in the grocery stores today, mostly what that looks like. So you want to have an idea of what it is you're trying to accomplish in the first place. It's not just crossbred are better because they're cheaper, or purebred are better because they're pure and more fancy. they have different purposes and they can be used together to do and to achieve different ends. Now, with the conversation of what you're trying to do and which type of animal, purebreds versus crosses, are going to be better, or if you're going to be using them in combination, it's important to think about heritability, meaning a trait that can be passed down, versus environmental factors. And it's funny because I see a lot of this stuff in pig forums on Facebook where people say, oh, I have a Berkshire, their meat is amazing. And if you buy our piglets, you're going to have amazing meat. And that doesn't really factor in the environmental considerations of how was this animal raised? What were the temperatures like? What was the pasture like? What was the forage made up of that they were eating? What was the content of the feed? Did they have whey? Did they have milk? What time did they have outside? How clean was their environment? What sort of, drinking water did they have access to? How clean was that? There's all of these other factors and the stress that makes a big impact on the animal as well, certainly. And so these are factors that a lot of times don't get taken into account. People attribute a lot of these environmental factors to heritability because, well, I bred all these animals here. They have X, Y, and Z quality. Is it really baked into the cake, or is it something that you're actually putting in through the way you're raising the animal and what you're doing with it? So generally speaking, carcass quality, specifically structure and growth rate, are heritable. To a lesser extent, meat quality in terms of intermuscular fat, flavor, and tenderness, there is an extent to which that can be passed down genetically, but there's also a substantial extent to which that is environmental. The main things that are heritable are going to be the structure of the animal in terms of the skeleton, the way the skeleton is produced. And it's important to have a big, strong, sturdy skeleton because that is what the pig in its later months of life is going to hang the meat on. You have to build a big frame first because that's what the pig does when it's smaller. And then as it gets larger, that frame fills in with meat accordingly. You don't have it the other way around. So making structural improvements by adding different animals that have longer torsos, wider, stouter legs and arms and shoulders, these are all things that you can do by just adding in different genetics. And it's valuable to look at the way your animal walks and the way that they stand, because this is part of the structure of the animal. And if you look at animals that have weird feet, and when I started breeding, nobody told me about, hey, like you need to look at the way the feet are situated on your animal. And if they're kind of standing down on their heel, they call that the pasterns instead of like up on the toe. That's a structural quality issue that can come into play. Same thing with the spine. You want a nice, some people, and some of this is preference too, when it comes to genetics. There are some people that they like a nice flat spine. There are some people that prefer it to be a little bit rounded. The idea behind a rounded top on the pig is that this gives additional room for them to carry more meat. And then that arched top, like a strut on a car, it flattens out over time as it carries the weight on the lower half of their body, especially with females, with breeding females. You want them to have a little bit of an arched back because that means they have that flexibility built in where you can put a load of piglets on them and you can put a bunch of weight with the milk and the udder on them, and they'll be able to carry it because it's kind of rounded. And then as it puts that weight on, it's going to still flatten it out, but it's not going to have a dip in its back. And I want to show you some video of a pig that I have here that I bought when I was starting out breeding without really understanding the structural qualities that I should be looking for in my animals. Okay, just to highlight what I'm talking about here, look how far down on her heel this black and white girl is standing. And you can kind of see how her back dips down a little bit. This one here, look how she stands up right on her toes, nice and straight. And she's still pretty young. She's still pretty young at this point, but you can see she's got a nice she's got a little bit of a rounded top to her because she's got good musculature up top that's going to support her. That's going to support her as she's carrying babies. Nice straight toes, nice rounded top. That's what we're looking for compared to kind of a dip in the middle and the flat feet. And these are directly heritable things, and that's the reason why I have not and don't breed any of this pig's offspring. They are just for meat at this point because ultimately her legs are all wonky, her spine has a big dip in it, and her feet are she's kind of flat-footed, and these are not desirable characteristics. These are things to be looking for because these are heritable characteristics directly related to the structure and the size of the animal. Temperament is another thing that isn't strictly passed down through genetics. A lot of that is going to be environmental and the way that you socialize, spend time with, and treat the animals, which is another reason why you go on these Facebook groups and you see people talking about, oh, I had this Tamworth and oh my God, they're the meanest, most beastly animals. And there's some people that talk about how the old spots are the sweetest animals. And I've had old spots that are just nasty. So again, a lot of it just depends, and it's not going to be strictly determined by genetic lineage. So looking at genetics, you want to have a plan going in because ultimately the first animals that you're going to be buying to breed, you're going to have a certain list of ingredients that are going to be baked into the genetic cake of that animal. And your starting point is always going to have to go somewhere. You don't buy the finished product, you're buying a start to a process that you are going to undertake and develop over multiple generations of this animal. And so you're starting from a certain point, but you have to have a plan and say, okay, here's what I like, here's what could be better, and here's what I'm going to bring in to address that need. And when you are looking at needs and weaknesses and flaws, you want to try to fix one thing at a time. So you're not necessarily trying to fix the bad feet on this animal and the length of the torso or whatnot. You want to be thinking, okay, I'm going to bring in another animal that matches the good qualities so we're not losing those and is a little bit better because they have the one missing thing that I'm trying to put in. So if you have a nice animal with a nice long torso and that has good structure, you want to bring in a sow, let's say, to match with this boar who has all of those same characteristics. So you're not losing any of the ground that you've gained with the one animal, but that is a little bit better because they have better feet. And then the offspring presumably will be able to have the structural benefits of the sire, but also have the additional benefits of having better feet that he's inherited from the mom. And then that animal you can go on and rebreed and cross or add in another pairing that is going to address, maybe you want to add in better fat composition or distribution or something that's going to try to address a lack in terms of the meat quality, right? Or growth rate. There's different things that you can take at different times. But my point is that you don't want to try to address too many variables all in one shot. You want to take one thing at a time. So each pairing has one specific outcome that you're trying to improve. And in order to make that happen, you have to be prepared to cull hard. That means that if you have an animal that is not the best of both parents, that animal goes to the freezer, no questions asked, not, oh, well, I mean, it seemed kind of nice, so I'm going to let it go. The animals that you keep, they need to be the best of the best. You select the best and you eat the rest. You get to eat your mistakes, which is great. And that sampling gives you an indication of the meat quality that's being produced from that, the parents, the pairing, but you're being very careful not to reproduce any of the offspring unless they are the absolute apex of quality, so that each new generation that goes on to breed is going to be better than the generation that produced it. And you're making the breed better. You're making the animals and the piglets that you are selling into your market to your customers. You're making these animals better than just saying, oh, here's a breed of this and here's a purebred of that. And now you have these animals, and isn't that great? But you're actually taking all of those ingredients and you're selecting to intentionally achieve a better pig. And you're doing that by being careful about what you're picking. So part of that means that you have to be keeping records. You have to be attentive to detail. And I think on commercial operations, when they have people who get paid to just walk around with the clipboard and jot down numbers, it would be nice to have that kind of time. But ultimately, you, as the producer, you have to say, I don't have time to track everything. Here is what I am going to track because this is the thing that really means the most to me. For me, I would say like the weight of the piglets when they are weaned, that is something that is significant to me. I want to track that to see, are they getting better? Are they staying the same? And then the other thing is like their weight at about 6 months of age. And if you're able to take the time to track a couple of different things, at least you're not going to have all of the information comprehensively, but you're going to be able to say, according to the metrics that I'm tracking, they're getting better in each successive breeding rather than, well, I'm just tracking a whole bunch of different things and some of them seem better and some of them seem worse. And I don't know really which direction it's going. So I don't know how to make accurate and good decisions about whether I should cull this breeding pair or whether I should breed them differently. You want to be able to say, no, I have data that suggests that we're going in the right direction. Let's do more of that. And of course, that's a lot of what moving in the right direction means is going to be determined based on what we said initially. What is it that you're doing? What is your end goal? And based on your end goal, that's what's going to determine the things that you're tracking so that you're not trying to track a whole bunch of stuff and wind up with useless data, but that you can value your time and be efficient with your time and track the things that are specifically going to be relevant to the people you're selling to. I know in my area, most of the people don't really care about what the weight of the piglets are at weaning, but I care about the weight of the piglets at weaning because that speaks to how well the mother does with producing milk. But most of the people, the farmers that I'm selling piglets to, they care much more about, with a normal feeding ration, 5 pounds per day or so. This is what you can expect to see at about 6 months. That's a really important number. So I try to keep track of that within the animals that I am raising. So after kind of doing a little bit of a dig into genetics, where do we actually start with our genetics? And it's okay to say that, look, there's a lot of breeds out there that are good. So pick animals that you like. I think that's a really good idea for a place to start. I also think that it's a good idea to have two purebreds that are of different breeds. So for example, I have Tamworth boar and I have old spot females. The old spots tend to be good mothers. They have very good maternal characteristics and qualities. They're good milk producers. They tend to be relatively docile. They do produce a decent amount of fat, but the Tamworth tends to be a little bit on the leaner side. So you can see where crossing these two purebreds is going to get us a cross that has hybrid vigor, because crossing two purebreds, so there's a lot of genetic diversity coming to grips with each other right there. And then you're also going to hopefully have the little fattier on the mother side with the old spot, a little bit leaner and longer on the dad side with the Tamworth genetics. And you put those together, you get a little bit faster growth, and that's a good place to start. If you're thinking about a Tamworth and a Berkshire, or a Tamworth and a Duroc, for example, I really had some interesting crosses. There's a lot of things that you can do. I certainly haven't done all the crosses in my 4 years of breeding pigs, but what I would say is start from a place where you like the animals or you're interested in the animals. And we'll talk more in other videos. And I have made other videos, in fact, about which breeds to select, but don't be cheap with your initial set of breeding animals. Get good quality genetics. And that doesn't necessarily mean purebred. I would recommend purebred because from crossing two purebreds, you get hybrid vigor. But if you get a good hybrid animal, you can get a really good mother. And kind of the competing elements within breeding are always going to be maternal characteristics and meat quality and growth speed. Because it's not all about growth speed. If you're losing half of your piglets, you're losing money out there. So you have to find a good balance between the heritable characteristics, or the obviously heritable characteristics, of the carcass and the carcass quality and growth speed, versus the less obviously heritable characteristics of mothering abilities. Because some of the maternal characteristics, like milk production, that certainly is genetic, but the ability to be careful and not step on babies and all of that, I am not aware of any evidence that is a heritable quality as much as it is sort of, the way the animal just comes out and is developed over time. So you have a variety of competing interests. And if you have a good mother that is a result of a handful of genetic pairings, then a crossbred animal is not necessarily going to be bad, but you want to spend time and money to invest in good genetics that come from a breeder who is having these conversations, who is doing this work in their own herd over generations on their own farm, and will be able to help you pick the right ingredients that are going to enable you to breed animals that are going to be complementary to each other, where the successive generations are going to produce what it is that you are trying to have and to try to sell to your customers. In simplest terms, my recommendation is purebred boar, purebred sow of different breeds. Those are bred together, and then the resulting offspring is bred to another purebred animal of a third breed. And this is a three-way cross where you have two purebred parents, they have a baby, series of babies. The best of that litter is then bred to another purebred, let's just say a sow, because it's going to be a little bit easier. Fiddling with the genetics in your animals is a multi-generational process. It's not something that you do by just buying a really hot shot boar off of Shipley's and now everything is going to be great. It's a multi-generational process where you use those genetics, but you have them and you repeat them and you use them over time. And that's the way that you get a better product that, again, allows you to market greater value in what you're selling and what you're doing, because it's not just one purchase of this one great animal. It's, we've arrived at this culmination of quality because we have refined it and made it a little bit better with every breeding, every pairing, every generation, so that in 4 or 5 years, you should be able to look at your herd of animals and say, this is where we started and this is where we have come, and we've made these improvements as a result. If you can do that, your breeding program will grow and it can become profitable and can become more notorious, so that you have people pursuing you for the quality of the genetics that you are producing and that you're putting out. And that's ultimately what I want to encourage anyone who is coming to me for breeders or breeding advice is, start with quality genetics and then make them better. Don't start with poor quality genetics and try to rescue them, because you save yourself a lot of time and effort if you have just good ingredients that you can start with. And if you're not going to breed deliberately with intention to make a better pig than the parents, then you're missing the whole point, other than cute piglets. I mean, you get that benefit if you, regardless how you breed. But if you're not really being deliberate and intentional with the way that you're breeding, then you're missing the biggest benefit, which is being able to control and develop the genetics and be able to take genetics that start over here and progressing them towards a better, more satisfying, desirable animal. If you're just kind of saying, the hell with it, we got babies and they're piglets and they're reasonably healthy and that's good enough, then you're missing the point, and you would probably be better to go to a breeder who is doing that kind of work and buy their piglets, because for the little bit of extra hassle and the money that you spend to buy piglets, you're not having to waste your time with animals year round. You're getting an animal that's going to grow better and going to be more profitable for you, because you're getting it from a breeder who is actively working to improve the breeds that they're working with. And so that's the way I would encourage you to think about it, not from a standpoint of genetic superiority, but from a standpoint of multi-generational genetic progression and improvement. And there's a lot of good resources, a lot of good books, like we talked about in the beginning, that are out there waiting to be discovered and rediscovered, so that you can find different windows into the game, into the process, so that you can get better at it. And one of the ways that it helps too is just being on here, comparing notes and hearing different things that people can share and say, this is what I've tried that worked, this is what I tried that didn't work, and see what your mileage may show. I'd love to have you subscribe to this channel. We will talk more on upcoming videos as we complete this series on breeding and try to help you build a better herd, and as we build a community of farmers in the United States, because we need to make America farmers again. I'm Stephen Reichert. This is Rowan Ridge Farm, and we will see you guys on the next video.